He is founding executive director of Foundation Beyond Belief, a humanist nonprofit that supports charities and encourages volunteerism in the non-theist community. He is author of a number of books, including Parenting Beyond Belief, Raising Freethinkers, and Atheism for Dummies. Dale is managing editor of the Atheist channel at patheist.com and national director of ethical education for the American Ethical Union, which is the umbrella organization for our society. And today, Dale will speak to us about his most recent book. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to tell you the agenda. I just realized. So hold that thought. After the talk, we will have baskets passing around. Then we'll have Q&A, and then we'll have announcements. So just, you know the lay of the land. Back to Dale. He will speak to us about his most recent book, In Faith and in Doubt, the first book of its kind, which is about marriages between religious believers and non-believers. Welcome.
Thank you, Svetlana. Hello, everybody. I am Dale McGowan, and I marry Baptists. Actually, only one so far, but it's gone so well that I just might do it again. I married a Baptist 23 years ago, not just a generic Baptist, but a Southern Baptist, born and bred, and just months before the wedding, I witnessed the adult baptism ceremony that reconfirmed her in the faith. And her stepfather, uncle, and grandfather were all Southern Baptist ministers. Her parents met at a Baptist college. She prayed, read a daily devotional, and attended church, and intended to continue doing that once we were married. And I am an atheist, and I have been since I was a teenager. Now, the Bible is not unclear about unions like this. I think it's 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? I'm the darkness in this scenario. And the literature on mixed belief marriage is nearly unanimous in its warnings. Marrying outside of your belief system, no matter what it is, leads inevitably to unhappiness, divorce, and bitter regret. Now, the first time I read that, we had been married for about 10 years, and I thought, well, that's strange. We must be doing it wrong. And we had had a few frustrations around religious questions, but the marriage was never unhappy, and our conflict level was always really low. But I had some atheist friends then, and I still do now, who are married to religious believers. Actually, 59% of the non-religious who are married to someone who is religious. And some of them have had painful and unhappy marriages. Some have divorced, and sometimes it was specifically because of issues related to the religious difference. So instead of assuming that all marriages between believers and non-believers fail, we're left with a much more interesting question, which is, why do some fail and others succeed really well? What's the difference? And that sounded like a book to me, so I wrote it. Most of the authors who rail against mixed belief marriage, I began to notice, were clergy. The vast majority are clergy. And a lot come right out and say that they oppose the mix because of the threat it poses to religious identities, that families who are in a mixed belief situation have a much greater tendency to drift away from a single religious community. And that is a reasonable concern for a member of the clergy. The problem is that they surround that reasonable concern with a lot of false claims about mixed marriage, and that's really not okay. One example is Rabbi Kalman Pakuz, who wrote the book, How to Prevent an Intermarriage. So he has a point of view. He said that, first of all, he does counseling for young people who are thinking of getting married, and if they are an interfaith couple, he uses the counseling session to talk them out of it. And he says that when Jewish parents have a child who declares an intention to marry someone who isn't Jewish, the parents must disown the child and sit Shiva, declaring the child dead to them, only relenting if the child comes around. Very Fiddler on the Roof. And every once in a while, I actually hear a mild version of this from the atheist side. There's a conference I was at about five or 6 years ago, and a guy came up to me and said, with a completely straight face, that he thought atheists should only marry atheists so that their kids would become atheists because, as he put it, our retention rate is not good. You see, I had stupidly disregarded the atheist retention rate when I fell in love with my wife. During the research for the book, one of the pieces I came across was a Washington Post article, an opinion piece by the author of one of these Jeremiads. She, not a clergy person herself, but Jewish identity. And she said, interfaith marriages often come with a heavy price. They are more likely than same-faith unions, in some circumstances, to end in divorce. Now let me repeat that. Interfaith marriages are more likely in some circumstances to end in divorce. This is like saying men named Steve are more likely to get divorced in some circumstances. Of course they are. Steves who commit serial infidelity might divorce more often, for example. But their Steveness would have nothing to do with it. The question is whether the religious difference is the thing that increases the risk of failure in interfaith marriages. And when you consult research instead of clergy, it becomes clear that when there is a difference, other risk factors are almost always in play. And sometimes the difference exacerbates the existing risk factors, but it is rarely the cause of the problem, and usually there's no difference at all in the strength of the marriage. There's a 2005 study that found that, quote, the belief dissimilarity of spouses has little effect on the likelihood of dissolution of marriage over time. A 2009 study found, quote, absolutely no difference in marital satisfaction between people who were married to partners of the same faith and people married to partners of a different faith. But an atheist and a believer, isn't that a bridge too far? And on the surface, it might seem like it. It seems like a problem because when most believers hear atheist, they actually think anti-theist. They think of someone who thinks religion poisons everything, Christopher Hitchens, for example. And when most atheists hear that someone is religious, they tend to think of Pat Robertson. And granted, Hitchens and Robertson would not have made a great marriage, but although that's fun to picture. But most atheists aren't anti-theists, and most religious people aren't fundamentalists. That's why the marriages work. It's really a very simple thing. So let's start with the atheists and look at what the actual situation is. It's a wonderful University of Tennessee study that came out in 2013, profiled 1,100 atheists, this very in-depth survey instrument. And it created a typology of 6 different types of atheists. Only about 1 in 7 atheists in the study fit the anti-theist category, 14.8%. Now, they probably aren't the best candidates for a happy marriage with a religious partner, but fortunately, they aren't the ones who are likely to even try. The other 85% of atheists have varying degrees of willingness to coexist with religion and the religious, and they are the ones making all these perfectly lovely relationships with believers. Now, the same thing happens on the other side of the fence, and the problem is that you have these statements of belief in churches, right? These formal doctrines. And when someone asks, what do Catholics believe? Google, what do Catholics believe? And then you will be told, Catholics believe, and you will be given the catechism, right? You will be given the doctrinal statements of the Catholic catechism. Well, according to this, Catholics believe that baptism is necessary for salvation, that all humans are born with original sin, that homosexual acts are, quote, intrinsically disordered, that birth control is intrinsically evil, that a divorced person who remarries is an adulterer, and that abortion is, without exception, a moral evil. Okay? That's what it says Catholics believe. And pretty much every single one of those is in strong conflict with the beliefs and social values of most atheists. But these are not statements of what Catholics believe. These are the doctrines of the Catholic Church, which is a very different thing. When you ask actual U.S. Catholics what they believe, you learn that 54% support gay marriage. Catholic individuals were ahead of the general population in gay marriage. Actually, I think they still are. I think the general population's at 52 and they're at 54, or both of those have gone up. 58% of Catholics support abortion rights. 69% differ with the church on divorce, and 82% believe birth control is morally acceptable. So U.S. Catholics have more common ground with the non-religious than they do with the Catholic Church. And it's not just Catholics. Large majorities of mainline Protestants also support gay marriage, abortion rights, access to birth control. 2/3 of U.S. Christians support evolution. You know, we think of evolution education as being a religious, non-religious issue. It's not. Fewer than 1/3 of U.S. Christians are biblical literalists. It was 2/3 the year I was born. Never mind what year that was. My wife's beliefs were actually a perfect example of the difference between the person and the church. She identified as a Baptist, but if she fully ascribed to the Baptist faith and message, which is the doctrinal statement of the Baptist Church, I really doubt that we would ever married. Now, she agreed with some parts, but the Baptist faith and message also includes a few really important things that she didn't agree with at all. And I asked her to go through the Baptist faith and message and indicate, to the best of her recollection, which things she held true when we were first married, because people's opinions drift over time. And she is a really good sport, so she sat down with this thing, 4-page document, and she put true or false in the margin next to each belief statement on the Baptist faith and message. Here's the outcome. She believed that there is only one God, that he is perfect, all-powerful, and all-knowing, and that man was made in his image. But she never believed that man brought sin into the human race by disobedience, nor that, quote, as soon as people are capable of moral action, they become transgressors and are under condemnation. It's usually around age 12 when we go under condemnation. She believed that Christ was the Son of God, but not that he was born of a virgin, nor that salvation is available only through him. She was something of a universalist in that way. She did not agree that all Scripture is totally true and trustworthy, nor that, quote, Christianity is the faith of enlightenment and intelligence. And she didn't agree that Sunday should have any special restrictions. Now, she did believe that baptism is, quote, an act of obedience symbolizing the believer's faith in a crucified, buried, and risen Savior, the believer's death to sin, the burial of the old life, and the resurrection to walk in newness of life in Jesus Christ, as well as faith in the final resurrection of the dead. But she didn't believe it's the duty and privilege of every follower of Christ to evangelize others to the faith. And she didn't think the world would end the way it's described in the book of Revelation. She agreed that Christians should oppose racism and work to provide for the orphaned, the needy, and the abused. But she did not agree that homosexuality is a form of, quote, sexual immorality, that Christians should speak on behalf of the unborn, nor that the strict definition of marriage should be the uniting of one man and one woman. She also never believed that it was her place to, quote, submit herself graciously to the servant leadership of her husband. Now, the thing is, if I tallied up my own agreements and disagreements with the Baptist faith and message at the time of our marriage, Becca and I would have overlapped by about 3/4. I also reject the book of Revelation and want to be nice to orphans. I mean, there's a lot of play there. But some people might say, yeah, okay, so 3/4 agreement, but the stuff you disagree on is pretty big, right? God and Jesus and what happens when we die is pretty big. Doesn't get much bigger than that, right? Now, this is actually the linchpin, the key to understanding why religious believers and non-believers can and do coexist beautifully, even in the intimate bonds of marriage. Yes, God is a big question in one way. But there's an important way in which God, compared to many other questions, is actually a small question, actually a trivial question. Here's what I mean. Just suppose that my wife's opinions on the Baptist faith and message were reversed. So let's say she rejected God and Jesus, didn't believe in salvation, but she thought homosexuality was a sin, and that marriage should be reserved for one man and one subservient woman, and that women should not have full reproductive rights. Now, in the day-to-day living of a marriage, those are much bigger questions than the relative abstractions of theology. Sitting across the table from somebody who thinks that gay rights is an abomination is much more difficult for me than somebody who happens to believe that God exists. These are values that would have made it really hard for me to imagine sharing a life with someone. But as it was, we were aligned on the big questions. We just differed on the small questions like God. Okay. Now, mixed belief marriage of all kinds is actually much more common now than it was a couple of generations ago. In the 50s, religiously mixed marriages were in the single digits, and now 27% of all marriages are religiously mixed. And if you ask somebody why it's so much more common now, they would typically say, well, attitudes have changed, right? Social mores have relaxed. Well, that's not really an answer. That's putting the cart before the horse. What made the attitudes change toward mixed marriage? And it turns out that it's mostly about who you know. Like so many social issues, it's about who you know. Now, in the past, it wasn't unusual for Americans to grow up, go to school, live, play, work, and die surrounded only by people with the same religion, right? Neighborhoods used to be sectioned off by religion. Catholic South Boston, Jewish Borough Park in Brooklyn. People used to move once or twice in a lifetime, if that, usually within the same community. American mobility has changed this. Now the average move for Americans in a lifetime is 11.7 times. Often hundreds of miles or thousands of miles. And then you combine that with social and economic mobility, and we now live, work, and play in the midst of a diversity that's just unimaginable to our grandparents. There's also college. College is another mixer. It's the first place that a lot of people experience real diversity of religion, politics, and race. And college attendance is up 200% since the 1950s, meaning a lot more people are surrounded by difference right around the age when they're thinking about potential mates. That's where this atheist met his Baptist wife, by the way, was in college. Only 7% of Americans, now this is a staggering set of statistics coming up here, I think. Only 7% of Americans now say that all of their neighbors share the same religion. And only 16% say most do. That means 3 out of 4 Americans are living in neighborhoods with significant religious diversity. That's huge, and it's different. It's a change. And even families are less religiously uniform. Fewer than a third of respondents in the Faith Matters survey said their extended family members all share the same religion. Fewer than a third. That's a big change. Close friends. When asked how many of their 5 closest friends had the same religion they did, only 24% said all of them did. That means 3 out of 4 Americans now have at least one close friend of another religious perspective. That changes things. That changes the way you see other religions. So we don't just have this vague awareness of religious difference anymore, this sort of cartoonish awareness in the same way. Most Americans are now intimately acquainted with people of other faiths and of no faith at all. And one of the many consequences is more religiously mixed marriages, including marriages between believers and non-believers. So in putting the book together, I wanted to start by sort of laying out that landscape, showing how the cultural frame has changed. So I talked about how marriage is changing, the diversity among the religious and the non-religious, the difference between individual beliefs and church doctrines, all that sort of thing. I did a survey of about 1,000 people who are in believer-non-believer relationships, and I tried to isolate some of these areas of conflict. So I want to give you an idea of what some of those were. What are the things that make that difference in the marriages working or not? One of the helpful things is talking about the religious difference early, preferably before you're married. This is actually, I had a large number of people, not a large number, but a significant number of people in the survey who were already different at the time they got married, but the atheist, typically, didn't share that until the honeymoon. No, not the honeymoon, but it's at some point down the line. That's not helpful. Don't do that. Sharing it early is particularly helpful. It is also extremely helpful if you were already different at the time of the marriage. Couples who had the most conflict were those who were the same, had the same religious perspective when they got married, and one of them changed later. That tended to be, there was a feeling of betrayal from the religious partner frequently, because it was almost always a religious partner who became non-religious, and that was a very, very high level of conflict and eventual problems. Those who made an effort to learn about the other's worldview, that was a big plus. If somebody actually went out of the way to learn, they're married to a Catholic and they learn about Catholicism, married to an atheist and they learn about atheism, that tended to go over really well and reduce conflict. Trying to convert your partner. I think that ended up being the single biggest variable in irritation, tension, conflict in couples, is a high desire by the other to convert you. That's just a high ongoing desire. A sort of passive, oh, I kind of wish we were the same. That's fine. Some people talked about that. But an active desire, you're basically saying you're not okay. I'm not going to be okay with you until you do this thing. Supporting and protecting each other from mistreatment, a big, big plus. If you have an extended family that puts a lot of pressure on, for example, the atheist in the couple, you have an extended evangelical family or something like that, and the evangelical spouse doesn't have your back, sort of either sides with the family or is quiet in the face of this sort of thing, that's a lot of tension. But if you actually stand up for your partner and say, this is a person I love, this is a person I've chosen to spend my life with, it's not okay to isolate or abuse this person, that's a big plus. If the religious partner is Mormon, Pentecostal, or a Jehovah's Witness, those are the three that correlated with a lot of tension. Catholicism did not correlate with a lot of tension in the survey. It's interesting. Evangelicals didn't uniformly. It depends a lot in the evangelicals, but almost all of the Mormon, Pentecostal, and Jehovah's Witness mixes had a lot of conflict. Separating respect for the person from respect for the beliefs. Boom. If the non-religious partner identifies as an anti-theist, boom. Clearly defining negotiables and non-negotiables in the relationship. Not everything is non-negotiable in a relationship. And if you go in sort of thinking that, it's not going to work. But if you can clearly say, these are the things that are really important to me. My wife said to me before we were married, I want to go to church. That's an important thing to me. We talked about the fact that I'm an atheist, but she still wanted to go to church. I said, that's entirely fine. I'll go with you. And I went to church with her for a while. I was very good. It was about 5 years, and then it became very difficult. And the day it became difficult was the day the minister spoke on that 2 Corinthians passage about, he basically told my wife to leave me. Is what the message was for he was probably talking to some other people too, but I heard it as aimed right at me. So I laid out all these factors in the book, and then I chose 8 couples from the survey who had put these issues into a real-life context. And I tried to get a few different denominations and other variables and different outcomes as well. 4 of the featured couples have had very successful marriages, and 4 of them have not. They've run into severe trouble or even divorced. One couple consisted of 2 conservative Baptists, one of whom became an atheist a few years later. They've had a very difficult time, but they are still together. Another couple were already atheist and Baptist on their wedding day, but the arrival of a child brought out the issues, brought out the difference, and they eventually divorced. Another one of the featured couples were already different before they were married, atheist and evangelical. They get along really well, and they are still married. There are 3 Catholic and atheist couples. One of them, fascinating, this couple was a really interesting story. They ended up switching places. The Catholic became an atheist, and the atheist became actually a Baptist, not a Catholic, but a Baptist. And it was very interesting. They actually ended up having trouble and divorcing because they had both rejected what the other one ended up embracing. And that kind of an ex-smoker thing, I think, is what was going on there. It's like if you had formerly been religious and you rejected it, and then your spouse becomes religious, there's special dissonance there. Another Catholic and atheist couple had a lot of issues. She was really missing community because they weren't going to church anymore, and they met in Unitarianism. So they now attend a Unitarian fellowship. There's a gay couple, atheist and progressive Christian couple, whose religious differences just so pale in comparison to the civil rights struggle that they're in that it's a total non-issue. And there's also a non-religious American married to a Hindu South African. And it's fascinating to see what issues are similar and what issues are quite different there. So then so we lay out the eight couples, and the rest of the book explores specific topics like weddings and holidays and extended family and parenting issues that come up. But my favorite part of the book is the last chapter. I'm so glad I included this. I asked respondents to the survey to list specific benefits that they feel they got from the mixed marriage, because we're talking a whole lot about the conflicts and what the level of conflict is and all this, and I just said, what are some of the benefits that you found? And fewer than 5% of respondents said they couldn't think of any benefits, that it's only been difficult. The rest offered not only benefits, but a lot of the same benefits over and over again, and that's when you know you're onto something. Religious partners often describe becoming more universalist in their views, feeling that everyone is saved, not just believers. They've become less fearful and distrusting of atheists. They tend to be more comfortable with difference generally and more liberal in their social views and less convinced that religious belief is necessary to be moral. Those are a lot of good outcomes. And over, they were crediting their partner and their partner's example with making this change in the way they see the world. Non-believing partners speak of a more nuanced view of religion, seeing a wider range of good and bad, and being more willing to coexist with the religious, and being less convinced that religious belief indicates a lack of intelligence. It's a good thing. Now, many respondents reported becoming a better example of their own worldview. One of them said, I think I'm a better Muslim than I was before I met my agnostic wife. I used to see things in fairly black and white ways and was very judgmental. She makes me think first about whether I am expressing the true heart of Islam in what I say. This is an Islamic partner whose agnostic spouse is making him a better Muslim. A lot of that kind of expression. Non-believer said, having a wife who is a liberal Christian helps me moderate my message and tailor things so that religious people will be more receptive. He's actually learning to speak more carefully and to think about the way he's presenting things. One Lutheran respondent credits her husband's influence with getting her to change from the Missouri Synod to the more progressive ELCA. One evangelical Christian said, having my nice little Christian bubble popped has been a good thing. I'm more liberal on issues like abortion and gay rights, which drives my friends crazy. Many non-believers are better able to let go of paralyzing resentments toward religion. Partners often find that they learn more about each other than they otherwise would have. Now, this was a really interesting pattern. A lot of people said, not only have I learned about my partner's religion or non-religion generally, I feel like we know each other more intimately than we would have because we actually talk about things. If we had the same perspective, there are a whole lot of issues we might not get into because we would just assume that we had the same opinion on it. But they end up exploring these deeper conversations than they might otherwise have done. Now, one thing I should mention, by the way, is that I have been in both a mixed belief and same belief marriage because Becca was a religious believer for the first 13 years of our marriage and then has been a non-believer for the last 9. And the interesting thing is that brings up a lot of assumptions in people when they hear that. A lot of atheist friends say, oh gosh, that must have been such a relief. Yeah. It was a non-issue. It was nothing that I agitated for, nothing that I pushed for. She became interested. She started doing some reading. She changed her mind. But what is the big takeaway in that for me was how little changed, how much stayed the same. We didn't have much conflict before. We didn't have much after. And actually, I began to worry a little bit about myself because in that situation, I kept myself fairly sharp. I listened to what I was saying. I thought about what I was saying in the presence of a religious believer. I was less of a sloppy thinker. I think I've gotten into more sloppy habits as a thinker now that I'm in a household with more uniform religious beliefs. So there's actually a disadvantage in the change. It's a little harder to keep myself honest. But one benefit, stood head and shoulders above the rest in the survey. One benefit. That being married across that gap increases a person's tolerance and open-mindedness about the other side of the gap. That was the one that came through over and over again. It's harder to dismiss all religious people as unintelligent or all atheists as immoral when you have fallen in love with a flesh and blood representative of the worldview. So as I finished the project, I felt really optimistic, which was not exactly my expectation. Not just about these marriages, but about the power of the mix in general, about the power of diversity in general, that it's not just a bumper sticker, it's not just a flag to carry. It isn't just liberal window dressing to say celebrate diversity. It really is the answer in so many ways. Thanks very much.
My question is about how to raise children in a mixed marriage, mixed faith marriage, because that can be a sort of conflict with whether to take the child to the church, to the ethical society, 1 week to one and 1 week to the other. So how do you solve that?
It's a very good question. This ended up being another one of the high conflict markers if the partners couldn't come to agreement on how to raise the children regarding religious issues. That was very difficult. Fortunately, my wife and I were in agreement, and a lot of progressive believers are in agreement with the secular, essentially that children should be in a position to have as much information as possible and to make their own decisions in this way. You don't have to hide what it is that you hold true. This is one of the things every once in a while in my parenting workshops, I'd have a parent say, I haven't even told my kids what I believe because I really don't want to indoctrinate them. And I just think, oh gosh, you can't do that. You really have to share who you are and what you believe and your passion and all that. But you follow that up by saying, the decision is yours and I will love you no less no matter what you decide. That's the important framework. My wife and I were in what I think is the perfect situation. We were in agreement that we would each share what it is that we believed with our kids, and that we would each follow it up by saying, but there are other people, other good people who believe differently. I want you to find them and talk to them so you can make up your own mind. Gosh, we're lucky there's one in our house. And I would say, go talk to Mom about this. I know she has a different opinion on whether Jesus actually came to life after he was dead. And then you get to think about it all you want. You can change your mind 1,000 times and I'll love you no less. That's the best approach. And the fortunate thing is that most of the non-religious and progressive religious agree on that. It's only when you have someone in a tradition that says they must only get one point of view that you're in trouble, because it's not good parenting, period. It's really that kind of authoritarian thing isn't good in general.
How specific did you get in your research? I know there was a lot of what you spoke of was people of faith versus people of non-faith.
Right.
But how specific did you get within people of, say, the same tradition, but different denominations, such as different Christian denominations, but they share the same Christianity, but different denominations, like Baptist versus Methodist or Lutheran or something like that?
Right. If they, what I was looking for this is a couple that defines themselves as believer and non-believer only. So they would have to be within a tradition and consider themselves non-believers. I did have a large number of, not a large number, but several Jewish couples who were theistic and non-theistic within the couple. So there's some of that. That's presented in the book as well. Beyond that, I don't think I had a lot of cultural Protestants, for example, who are non-believers but identify as Lutherans. I did have a good number of cultural Catholics, where you have a couple that are both Catholic and one of them identifies as a non-theist. So it's in the book. That's fascinating, because then they actually have the shared tradition and they have no trouble with what to do on a particular day or when the child turns 13 or whatever it is. They just differ on the small questions is what it ends up being.
Hi, this is going back to raising children with the first question. And sorry if this isn't the most clear question. I'm trying to think of how to word it. Did you see sort of an example in where there was an environment where there was sort of a level playing field between, mixed religions? Because I hear what you're saying about, giving children the opportunity to choose between, say, an atheist and a evangelical mother, father. But did you ever see any evidence where they chose something that wasn't one of those two, where they just, a Muslim child came out of completely two different? Because if it didn't, in I would think that just means that the kids are highly influenced by those, by those two choices that they have.
Right. Yeah, actually, there are a lot of examples. A lot of this has come out of my other parenting work, kind of the non-religious parenting work. But I've run across a large number of couples who've had exactly that. One of the very common ones is you have a believer, non-believer, and the believer's in a relatively mainstream Christian belief system. And the children will sometimes end up identifying as Buddhist or some sort of, non-Western or non-mainstream theology, sometimes, frequently non-theistic expression. So yeah, there are examples of that. Basically, what ends up happening with the child, it seems to be, if you raise a child in one tradition, they get the idea that that's the one they have to either accept or reject that tradition. If you give them two, the message they get is, I have a choice. And they don't get the message, I have a choice between these two. They get the idea that, oh, this is something that people choose. And so the tendency in many cases is to start thinking for yourself. And frequently they go a third way.
How did you find that couples navigated different religious traditions, whether it was a holy holiday, other than Christmas, because that's fairly, secular these days. But so for something like a Jewish holiday that is really significant and important, involves maybe cleaning the house, and would the couple, would they just say, okay, whatever you want, that if that's your prerogative, that's fine? How did you see those being?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that one, because this is actually one of my favorite outcomes. When people assume that the most difficult situation is that a believer-non-believer mix is going to be the most difficult combination, it's actually not. There's a big way in which it's much harder to bring two existing religious traditions together, because what you're doing is bringing two rule books together. There's a set of traditions. Here's what you do on Sunday in this tradition. And then another tradition says, no, you do this on Sunday. If you bring together a believer and a non-believer, you're bringing together one rule book with somebody who has a sort of non-binding worldview. There's not the same set of strictures. So they're actually able to negotiate and navigate it. And the answer is that it ends up across the spectrum. Some of them say, we'll do them all. I don't care. Sometimes the non-religious spouse will say, heck yeah, we'll do the religious holidays and go to church and all that sort of thing. And some say, sometimes the religious spouse will say, I actually don't feel the need to do any of those specific things. It's a personal belief to me. And I have one couple profiled, the Catholic and one of the Catholic and atheist couples, where he really felt that way. He's a Catholic, but it was a very private thing, and so the kids didn't have to really do any of those things. And then there's everything in between, where sometimes they'll say, this aspect of Catholic tradition or this aspect of Jewish tradition, I really want to do. And then you go to the non-religious spouse and say, is that all right if that's a non-negotiable for me? And they work it out, or they don't. So the terrific thing is that there are fewer points of non-negotiable conflict. Things are more negotiable in this situation, which is nice.
I was wondering if the discourse between the religious and non-religious might go up more if that religious belief was also tied to their ethnic or national identity. Would that cause more friction, or would it be about the same?
This is such an interesting thing. This can potentially be, it can make things more intractable. My favorite example of this is, just a really great example, is in Quebec. Quebec has always been the most religious province in Canada because the French initially only permitted Catholics to settle there. That'll do it. When it was New France. And mid-20th century, 83% of people in Quebec identified as Catholic, and it was the most religious province in Canada. Well, today, Quebec is the least religious province in Canada by a long shot, and still 83% identify as Catholic. People say, what? But if you ask somebody, do you believe in God? they will overwhelmingly say no in Quebec now. And then they say, what's your religious identity? And they say, Catholic, of course, right? They are cultural Catholics. And the reason they don't let go of their Catholicism is because it's tied to their Frenchness. It's tied to their French identity. And here they are surrounded by the English Protestants, right, in Canada. And they've got this, the French identity is such a strong and important thing to them. Well, that is lock, stock, tied in with Catholicism. They will not let go of that over a little question like God. I mean, it really is that kind of a thing. So it actually can make it difficult. It can make it more intractable if it's tied into identity more in whatever way. But it can also be, like in this case, it's not that much of a problem. It's tied into the identity, but the Quebec overwhelmingly 6 years ago voted to change their provincial school system from Catholic to secular. And it passed with just a breeze, with very little opposition. So it really depends on the nature of that identity and whether it's a hill to die on for the religious.
Okay, so I'm a member of a progressive Jewish community, and I joined the Ethical Humanist Society with my husband to have a community that we could both come to. Right. We're an interfaith couple, even though we're both Jewish, right. Culturally. So my question is, when we first came here, I was particularly aware of some of the disdain in a not very nice way that I felt expressed by individuals and by people addressing the community, the disdain that I felt for religion. So my question is, given how many intermarried marriages there are, what do you think our responsibility is in how we promote the atheist agenda but maintain a respect for religious people that may come here? We do say in our statement of belief that your belief or disbelief is not important to us, but I'm talking about at a different level than just a statement.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very important one. The key, I think, is as a community talking out loud about the need to separate out judgments and critiques of religious doctrine from individuals and understanding what that means. Understanding that it is possible for someone to have a religious identity. It's frequently true that someone has a religious identity and does not embrace the things that you find disagreeable. If we can start talking about that more and recognize what it means to separate people out from religion and from doctrine, that can be a tremendous help. The other nice thing is that it's happening very naturally anyway. One of the things that has been true of atheists up to this point, movement atheists, is that there are a lot of people who had painful separations from religion. They were ostracized by their family. They felt lied to, something like that. And so it's natural for them to turn around in this community and say, I defy you to say I'm going to hell. And there's just this very poisonous kind of response frequently. That is turning around. Young people now are much more likely to have grown up in a progressive religious environment or in a non-religious environment. It's happening demographically. My son is a perfect example of this. He would look at my work, which isn't even particularly confrontational, and he'd say, what's the big deal with religion? Why do atheists talk about religion all the time? And he's an atheist, right? But the generation that's coming up now has a very, very different attitude about it. He has religious peers who don't care. It's cool, you're an atheist, whatever. It's much more common now than it was for our generation. So it's going to just very naturally happen in the next, 10, 20 years, that we're shifting in a direction where we coexist and are treating each other like people rather than worrying so much about the doctrines.
Oh, so hard to narrow down a question. So many questions. I'm thinking of that famous marriage, Mary Matalin and James Carville. What the pillow talk is. But anyway, so
I think my problem is I have difficulty understanding, maybe you can speak to this, I have difficulty understanding people who, I can understand being sort of culturally Catholic or Baptist, but people support those institutions with their feet and their money as well.
Yes.
And some of those institutions don't like gays, don't want gays, are not particularly sensitive to African American voting rights, you know. So how do you get over that? How do I have more understanding and get over that cognitive dissonance? I think I'd have a hard time, you know, if I was married to someone who gave a lot of money to a religious institution that as an institution does not support ethics or, you know, that I hold dear.
It's a very good question. This is something that we've actually had a little experience with in my wife's extended family. We actually have a beloved family member who has gradually been shifting in her political views in a way that's really very encouraging over the years, from a very conservative, very lockstep Southern Baptist frame to a pretty darn progressive frame. And we have started gently having these conversations about exactly that. And one of the ways that we initially introduced it was in the election cycle. And we simply pointed her to one of those awesome websites that they've got now where you actually enter your positions on various social issues and then it tells you who you ought to be voting for if those are your positions. This is a very sobering thing for me because I ended up aligned with a candidate who I didn't end up voting for. You know, it's that sort of, I ended up aligning with the Green candidate right down the ballot. And for pragmatic reasons, you know, I didn't end up voting for the Green candidate for president. But it really stuck in my craw, and it does to this day. And so those sorts of things, those sorts of conversations, depending on the nature of your relationship, are the things that can start a person recognizing that they ought to be supporting the things that they actually feel, that actually meet with their money, with their feet, with their talents, with their voices, all those things. And with my wife, it was because you know we went to a Baptist megachurch. It was a megachurch, and they had a conservative social agenda and all that was really troubling. And it was she was in a position of self-discovery that she was eventually able to, you know, tip the balance on. The problem is if you try to lead somebody by the nose, you can frequently get them to dig in. It just really, it's something you have to figure out in your own relationships, you know, what you can do and what the leverage can be and how slowly or how quickly you can move. But it really is a thing worth doing, worth thinking about. It's just that if we really try to aggressively do it, we frequently get the opposite result and the door closes.
Hi. When it comes to marital bliss and with tolerance, there must be a self-selection aspect. For example, one of my best friends in college informed me rather matter-of-factly that we couldn't date because I was going to be going to hell, and she wasn't, and she wanted to spend eternity with her future husband. So as it turns out, we didn't get married and we didn't get divorced later. But also in terms of tolerance, you say that you spent 5 years going to the Catholic Church as an atheist, and I would really like you to expand on that because that just sounds like the worst possible outcome to me.
Yeah. Yeah, Baptist Church, which is worse, actually, in terms of the actual experience. I've gone to a lot of Catholic services as well, and those I just find tedious. But the Baptist message was very difficult a lot of the time. The fortunate thing is the actual senior minister in this place was really good, and he was intelligent, and he was much more progressive than his staff and than the congregation. So I was actually able to listen and appreciate what it was that he was actually doing and the sort of slightly subversive things he was doing along the way. But then he had these associates who would give these, you know, they had a portion of the service each time, and it was just, it got to the point where I wanted to support her. It's a very important thing for a lot of religious partners to have someone with them in the service. And it wasn't about converting me at all. It's about sharing the experience of being quiet together and reflective. And once a week, she and I would go and do this thing. But eventually the balance just tipped, and I was angry every day, every Sunday. We would get into the van, and I would issue forth, about the service. And I eventually started to feel that it was unfair to her, that I was actually interfering with her experience of it. And I eventually said, I can't do this anymore. I just can't. It's not fair to you. And she took it hard. And she was very respectful, and she didn't, insist. But she was very sad about that. But it was actually the beginning of her experience. It took her, several years after that. But that experience started to, sort of cause her to reflect on it. It was frequently not just difficult, but angering. It was frequently something where I was really actively angry to see all the heads nodding at some of the stuff that was being said. Yeah.
If parents have differing beliefs about the existence of a higher being, what, if any, formal religious or ethical education should they give their children in terms of a church or synagogue, Sunday school, or the kind of Sunday school that a place like this? What would you recommend as far as that goes?
A place like this, I would recommend. Honestly, I think, for ethical education, religious education, I think a situation like this is ideal. Unitarian Universalism, I think, has an ideal situation. There are, if you put a child in a position of learning about a number of belief systems, a number of ethical systems, of experiencing ethical action and ethical dilemmas and meeting with peers and working through that development together, that's how ethical development actually works. That's the ideal situation. The problem comes when you present them with one thing and say you have to accept or reject this thing, and if you reject it, you go to hell. And that's just this very counterproductive and one-dimensional kind of ethical development. So yes, I think this is the reason that I said yes when they asked me to be on the staff for the ethical movement. This is the situation we should give to all of our kids. I think kids have to know about religion in order to make a decision. If I completely block them off from it, you get what an awful lot of parents end up telling me when I find out. They say, oh, God, I don't know what to do. My 16-year-old daughter has become a door-knocking evangelical. She's, praising Jesus and all this. I don't know why this happened. We never talked about religion at all when she was growing up. Well, that's the problem. You need to actually give them the knowledge so that it doesn't become forbidden fruit. It doesn't become this magical answer to all their problems, right, out there. Let them see it. Let them get in the door, learn about religion, be in a religious service. I think they should actually have the experience of being in actively seeing it happen, not just reading it in a book. But a variety, not just one, right? My daughter loves to go to this. There's this Hindu temple near our house that she and a friend go to once in a while, and she said it's just awesome. It's kind of this meditative kind of thing and reflection, and it's very appealing to her. When you have a child in that situation, teach them to think well, and then just set them free. Just let them run. Give them all these various things to think about and let them run. I think that's the ideal situation, regardless of your own perspective.
Well, you just made all the points I was going to make. About this organization, but I would just add that in our Sunday school, we do glean from all the religions the one thing we do have in common, and that is the ethics and the values that we want to give our children. I would also say that I don't think of this as an atheist organization. It may be full of atheists, it doesn't matter. But on any given Sunday in our adult program, we don't address the issue of religion ever. I mean, we're talking about all kinds of different things, but it's incidental to what our programming is. And I think anybody of any faith can feel comfortable here.
Yeah, this is the thing that's great about ethical culture is that it's gathering around something else. And initially, this just, people don't know how that's possible. How can you come together on a Sunday morning around something other than your theological beliefs? Well, you just do. You come together around your belief in the importance of ethical action. You come together around the idea that we should be trying to make a better world. That is something you can come together around. And you say, sure, you got your beliefs, that's fine, it's incidental. That's not why we're actually here. It's not actually that difficult a concept, and it's really quite a powerful one.
Fabulous. It just is. That's it. God told me he's fabulous. He's fabulous. My question is, when my kids got married, a rabbi refused to marry them, but would welcome them into their congregation after they're married. I'm curious if clergy have gotten back to you. Do they perceive you as a threat?
Oh, I don't know. It's possible, but I mean, I don't hear from them. But I can say for sure that the idea itself is threatening to conservative clergy. It is not threatening to progressive clergy. Progressive clergy are just fine with this. But it's interesting. There's been quite a squabble among, there are the 5 branches of Judaism, and the rabbinical understanding in each of them is slightly different on different issues. And I think it's 7, 5, it depends on where you draw the lines. But I'd be interested to hear where you're drawing the lines, because there's, but one of the interesting things is I think it's conservative, actually. There's orthodox and conservative. And the conservative rabbis are considering the idea of performing interfaith marriages, and it was absolutely disallowed. You were not actually even allowed to attend an interfaith marriage. You weren't allowed to be in the crowd for an interfaith marriage. And now they're actually moving in the direction of performing them. So there's a tremendous amount of shift. And part of it is a recognition that you're going to become irrelevant in the cultural fabric if you don't get on the ball with this reality.
Hi, thank you. It's such a wonderful talk. I'm wondering if you noticed any gender differences as far as which partner was the religious one?
Yeah.
And if that, I don't know, if there were any differences in how that made more conflict or less conflict when it was the other way?
Yeah, thanks. And that whole question is really interesting. Yes, there's a tremendous, I think it's 3-to-1. The tendency is that if it is an opposite-sex marriage, the tendency is that the male will be the atheist. That's more common, 3 times more common that the woman would be religious. And when it is the reverse, when the man is the religious partner, there's more conflict. It tends to be a higher degree of conflict. Yeah. So, I mean, there are lots of things you can read from that, but essentially, the male religious partners tended to be less flexible than women who are religious partners.
I'm going to take a prerogative, and then I'll get you of the moderator. So might there be certain decisions that the religious partner and the non-religious partner would approach differently because of the religiosity? I'm thinking specifically of something like alternative medicine, for example. Like if you are a critical thinker, I mean, you may be an atheist and not a critical thinker, but let's assume you're a critical thinker and you believe in things for which there's evidence, and then there's your partner who believes in things for which there is no evidence. Like, might you run into some difficulty around, like, should we try this, whatever, treatment? Are there other areas like that where decision-making would be complicated by one person's religiosity and not, the others?
Yeah, and it doesn't actually go quite the way you'd think. For example, if someone is part of a conservative religious tradition, they will tend, in many cases, to reject homeopathy, karma, various things that are looked on as pseudoscientific. If they are in a progressive religious tradition, they will sometimes embrace that, right? The non-religious, it's very much a mixed bag. And this is actually becoming much more talked about in the atheist and humanist community. there's sort of an assumption by a lot of atheists that no atheist would believe that garbage, whatever it is. And lo and behold, you start hearing, you start talking to people, and you find that there are a lot of people who reject God and Jesus utterly, but embrace, UFOs and 9/11 truther stuff and karma and, whatever. So it's not all on one side. It's very much a mix, and it just depends on, you can have a religious and non-religious spouse who are in agreement on all that stuff in either direction, or they can be different. It's very interesting.
Hi, my husband and I are in a mixed marriage, and we agreed that we would let the children be raised Catholic in my husband's tradition, although we expose them to my beliefs. At what point do you let the kids just totally make their own decision? Because obviously they'd rather hang out with mom than go to a Catholic church probably and sit there. But at what point do you know what I mean? I don't want them to pick something based on their kids and maybe aren't thinking through long term. So at what age do you just let them totally decide what they want?
Yeah, there is no way to say. And this comes up a lot in the other direction. So what you're essentially saying is, we're going to ask them to have the religious experience up to a point, and then they can decide they can opt out. Some people ask the opposite. We're going to keep them from the religious experience and then give them the chance to opt in. Either way, you have to know your kids. You really want to know your kids. My kids were different from each other. My oldest and my youngest, I have 3. My oldest and my youngest, from age 5, I could have sent them to vacation Bible school. I could have sent them to any combination of influences, and I would have been completely fine, very comfortable. They were going to sort it out. My middle child, I was concerned, very impressionable, very much wanting to please. And I could see her getting into a situation where she was not left in control of her own decision-making process. So for her, we waited a little longer until we were really comfortable just having her find her own way. And she's completely there now, and she has been for years. But you really just have to decide with your kids. And if you have a child who's having a religious education or whatever in a single setting, you just do what you can at home to make sure they're staying flexible. Just make sure they're staying open. Perfectly fine. My kids actually went to a Lutheran preschool. All 3 of them went to a Lutheran preschool. And it was terrific because they got that basic religious literacy. But then they always had the message at home that it was fine to ask questions. And they're absolutely never let anyone tell you that you can't ask a question. It's always fine. It's interesting. It's so interesting to ask these questions. And our 4-year-old daughter was going to her teacher in the preschool and saying, "Do you believe in God? Oh, that's interesting, because I don't think I believe in God. My dad doesn't believe in God," And then she would ask all these questions. And then she went through a period of time when she was a straightforward New Testament Christian. And then for a while, she was like a Zoroastrian or something. I mean, she had this, it's really interesting, because she got in kind of this, the whole world is sort of divided into good and evil, that it was really a little unsettling, but, and sort of an Einsteinian pantheist phase, she went through. So the thing you want to do is just be sure that no matter what the experiences are that your kids are having, you're helping them to stay open, to be able to make choices. There's really, if you can do that for them, it's really the greatest gift you can give them in that situation.
Okay, I've been told this will probably be the last question here, and it's actually, unfortunately, a little bit of a comment, but sort of add on to... Okay, all right. Okay, then this will be the last comment. Just an add-on. My brother, quite a few years ago, married a very devout Catholic woman. It's very important to her whole identity and things. And they went through the whole thing where my brother went to the Catholic lessons and thought about converting and stuff like this. And in the end, couldn't do it. He was sort of more of a whatever kind of religionist. But he had to agree that the kids would be raised Catholic. Which he said, so whatever. And so, but the kids went to Catholic Mass religiously for many, many, many years under any circumstances. Unfortunately, his wife did die a couple of years ago, but then that leaves it up to the kids. What do they want to do? And I think uniformly they chose not to go to Mass anymore. So I guess I'm wondering, and this was not my brother's influence at all, this was just their own choice. are there any statistics on, we've talked quite a bit about what happens to the kids, and they hopefully open their minds in a mixed marriage, et cetera. Are there any statistics on exactly what does happen with these kids? Do any of them actually turn to a devout religious upbringing? I guess that's more specifically, it seems hard for me to imagine if you have this wide viewpoint exposed that you would turn to a devout religious upbringing, but does this ever happen?
There is some really wonderful and interesting work done on religion switching in general. So asking how people were raised and then where they ended up later, what religion they switched to, or did they stay the same. It's actually the Pew Research Center. Just Google religious switching, and you'll find this. Faith in Flux, I think, was the name of the actual study. And it is fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And if you actually also Google the Internet Monk, who is he's this guy's Catholic monk, but he is fascinated by statistics. And he created a graphic to show with colored lines all the religious switching and where people start and where they go. So we have that data. People who were raised non-religiously, how many of them ended up, such and such. But we don't have it parsed out to the approach of the parents and whether they were open or whether they raised them strictly within, keeping out the other influences. But start with that and see if it gives you some of the answers that you want. It is beyond fascinating to just look at that graphic. The graphic's the best thing. The poll is great. But that graphic that the Internet Monk put together, I could look at for an hour. It's just so fascinating. But anecdotally, I can say that when somebody tells me that they have a child who really went all the way to the charismatic evangelical end of the religious spectrum after being raised non-religiously, they almost always also tell me that they shut them off from religion as a child. They didn't discuss it. They didn't expose them to it frequently. They ridiculed it. That's the only influence they had. And then the child rebelled against it. So that's anecdotal, though. That's just what it is.
Relevant to faith in flux, would you comment on the phenomenon that the original prophets of different religions were not followed? Buddha was said to have said that 500 years after his death, his teachings would be completely misunderstood. Jesus preached love and acceptance, and then came the Crusades, etc., the Spanish Inquisition. Could you comment on the relevance of that to the faith in flux?
Yeah, I actually wrote about this a little bit in Atheism for Dummies. It's a guarantee. When you have someone who starts a movement of any kind, philosophical, religious movement, political movement, or whatever, they are going to end up being deified by their followers, and then people will use that deification in whatever way suits them, and it frequently has nothing whatsoever to do with the original person. Yes, Buddha is credited with with laughing when people said that he was going to be a god after he died. It was ridiculous to him. There are a number of other figures like that. Look at what we've done with Ronald Reagan. Seriously, we'll take the figure, divorce entirely from the reality what that person is, and then make the person what we need them to be. And frequently we need a god. We need somebody to be a god for us. And that's what's happened to all of these, good teachers. And it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.